For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Joint Resolution 77, opposing the decision to end certain United States efforts to prevent Turkish military operations against Syrian Kurdish forces in northeast Syria.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 77, Joint Resolution opposing the decision to end certain United States efforts to prevent Turkish military operations against Syrian Kurdish forces in northeast Syria.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Joint Resolution 77.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the beginning of this Congress, when I became chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I've tried to work across the aisle to advance a bipartisan vision of what American foreign policy should be, what it can be when we're at our best. And that's a foreign policy rooted in our values, values like support for human rights and human dignity, a foreign policy that projects American leadership as a force for good in the world, a foreign policy that thrives on the power of partnerships and alliances. I've worked with my friend from Texas, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCall, to make sure that this vision is enshrined in the committee's work and that we do all we can to push the administration towards this approach. So, Mr. Speaker, for me, the last week has been just devastating. A week ago, President Trump had a phone call with Turkey's thuggish leader, President Erdogan. Against the advice of national security experts and military advisors, the President gave Erdogan the green light to charge into northern Syria, unleashing what has become a brutal campaign of violence against the Syrian Kurds, our partners, the Syrian Kurds, who courageously stood alongside us for many, many months and years in the fight against ISIS. Mr. Speaker, that reckless and impulsive decision was a betrayal of our partners. It was a gift to Russia, a gift to Iran, a gift to ISIS, and a gift to Assad. And it was a blow to our national security. Now, a week later, the same Kurdish forces who fought with American special forces to combat ISIS are now fighting tooth and nail to survive Turkey's slaughter. Russian and Syrian regime forces have quickly filled the vacuum left by the United States. President Trump's decision has allowed ISIS fighters in northern Syria to escape from prison, paving the way for a resurgence of the terrorist group. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card, if you remember Monopoly from the old days. And the humanitarian crisis is staggering. Already tens of thousands have been displaced. Families, women and children. There are stories of gruesome beheadings, torture, and abuse, all set into motion, unfortunately, by the actions of the President of the United States. What kind of message does this send to the world? How can America be trusted to keep its word when we betray one of our close partners, loyal and faithful partners? Just throw them out like an old shoe. How can America be trusted to keep its word when we make impulsive decisions that have such an immediate catastrophic impact on so many thousands of people? Congress must speak out against this disgrace. The measure we're considering today will send an unambiguous, bipartisan, hopefully bicameral rejection of Trump's policy in Syria. This measure calls on the White House to develop a strong, clear strategy on how to defeat ISIS now that President Trump has sparked its resurgence. It expresses strong support for Syrian Kurdish forces, recognizing their commitment and sacrifices in the fight against ISIS. And it calls on Turkey to immediately stop its military action in Syria. At President Trump's hands, American leadership has been laid low, and American foreign policy has become nothing more than a tool to advance his own interests. Today, we make clear that the Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and we want nothing to do with this disastrous policy. So, Mr. Speaker, I say to our colleagues, it is on us. It is on us to uphold our country's values, to strengthen our national security, to defend America's standing in the world. I call on all members on both sides of the aisle to support this resolution and make it clear where we stand. I reserve the balance of my time.
Balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to first begin with thanking Chairman Engel for his bipartisan work to craft legislation in response to this week's developments. We often say in our committee that politics stops at the water's edge. And in this time of crisis, I'm proud to work with him to lead the most bipartisan committee in the Congress. And today may be a dark day, but it would be much darker if we were divided instead of standing united. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this joint resolution. Simply put, the catastrophe that has unfolded in Syria over the past 10 days is almost beyond words. I'm concerned about the extreme long-term damage this has caused the United States' interests in the Middle East and to the Syrian people, including the Kurds. The United States has worked for years to prevent an armed conflict between our NATO ally Turkey and the Syrian Kurdish partners. Our presence in Syria was critical to countering and defeating ISIS, and until last week, helped prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Working with the Syrian Democratic Forces, the U.S. and our coalition partners eliminated ISIS's control of territory in Syria, and we're continuing to fight ISIS insurgents. I understand the administration's legitimate concerns about engaging our U.S. forces in long-term military operations. I, too, want to wind down our overseas conflicts and bring our troops home. But leaving northwest Syria now does not resolve the problem that brought us there in the first place. It only creates more. We need a residual force in place. The consequences of this decision have already unfolded before our very eyes. We have betrayed the trust of our Kurdish partners who fought bravely with us against ISIS to defeat and destroy the caliphate, and they paid a heavy price and thousands of lives lost. We must remember that Turkey's offensive affects not only Kurds, but also the people of northeastern Syria. So far, dozens of civilians have been killed and over 160,000 people have been displaced. Islamic State prisoners, jihadists, and affiliates are already breaking free, reversing our hard-fought gains to defeat these dangerous terrorists. And now our Syrian Kurdish partners have struck a deal with the Syrian regime. This gives Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers more territory and opportunity to advance their destabilizing agendas, including their war on the Syrian people. My colleague Ellie Engel and I drafted this resolution to show that we do not support this decision by the administration and to call on Turkey to end this destructive campaign in Syria. We urge the United States to support the affected communities of northeast Syria, including the Kurds, and we call upon the administration to support our Kurdish partners and stand with them just like they had stood for us for so long. And given the grave implications that an ISIS resurgence would have for our homeland security, we call on the administration to provide an updated counter-ISIS strategy. I do support the administration's decision to impose sanctions on key Turkish officials and make clear that there are more consequences for continuing this invasion, but more pressure is needed. Congress is only just beginning its work to repair the damage this decision has caused. Chairman Engel and I are working together on a bipartisan bill to sanction Turkey for as long as it continues this destructive offensive. I look forward to working with the chairman to bring this bill to the floor as soon as possible, and I urge all members to support this resolution, this joint resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I rise today with a heavy heart. 10 days ago, President Trump sealed the fate of our Kurdish partners in Syria when he gave President Erdogan of Turkey the green light to invade. I believe this callous and reckless decision will go down in history not only for its disregard for human life, but for the strategic malpractice of placing American troops in harm's way, allowing thousands of ISIS prisoners to go free and ceding influence over the region to Russia and the Assad regime. It was truly an unbelievably dangerous and stupid decision that undermines our national security and diminishes our moral authority in the world. I am pleased that this resolution has widespread bipartisan support. We need to pass it and get it on the President's desk as quickly as possible. But resolutions and sanctions, when they come, can't bring Kurdish children back to life. They can't reclaim our American military positions and equipment seized by the Russians, and they can't restore our credibility, which has been squandered as we have betrayed the trust of our Kurdish allies. I am sickened by this administration's actions, and we need to do everything we can as a Congress to make this right. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan resolution. I thank Mr. McCall and Mr. Engel for working together in a bipartisan way to send a very strong message that the Congress of the United States does not support this horrific decision that betrayed our allies and undermines American leadership in the world. And with it, I yield back.
Gentleman from Rhode Island yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for yielding. I'm proud to rise today in support of this bipartisan resolution that opposes the disastrous decision to remove U.S. forces from northern Syria and abandon our allies, the Kurds, to a Turkish invasion. Since 2014, the U.S. and our allies in the global coalition to defeat ISIS have fought side by side with the Kurds to end the caliphate and degrade the threat of terrorism to our homeland. Today, ISIS is beaten, but it's not broken. They remain a threat that requires continued engagement by both the United States and our partners. Just as the Kurds had our backs against ISIS, we need to have theirs. Instead, we're abandoning not just the Kurds, but also our coalition allies in Syria. We're eroding all the progress we've made. We're showing our friends and our enemies that a partnership with America means nothing. We're providing ISIS with the opportunity to reemerge and once again threaten the United States. And we're allowing Bashar al-Assad and Vladimir Putin to play the role of humanitarian saviors in Syria. As an undercover CIA officer, I chased terrorists around the globe and saw firsthand the threats facing our nation from the Middle East. And one of the things I learned when I was in the CIA was to be nice with nice guys and tough with tough guys, not the other way around. Because of this decision and all the actions and inactions that led up to this decision, we have let our friends down, we have hurt our national security, and we have ceded leadership in the region to Russia and Iran. I hope we can change our course, but I fear it may be too late. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colleagues, right now, with President Trump's permission, Turkey is slaughtering our Turkish allies, our Kurdish allies. The only people who stand between us and ISIS, men and women who have died by the thousands to protect Americans from terrorism. The families of our American constituents, like Seamus Yuksakaya from my district. And as a result, Russian and Syrian forces are taking our positions next to them. ISIS prisoners are escaping, and Mr. Chairman, the crisis has only just begun. We must act today because the President has taken the side of dictators and butchers. The President has never put his life on the line for our country, like our special forces soldiers who have been fighting terrorists in Syria, whom he mocked earlier today by saying they're shooting each other. But perhaps if he had not dodged the draft by lying about his feet, sending another American in his place to Vietnam, he would know something that all veterans know well, that there are a lot of ways you can fail in battle. You can fail physically, you can fail to summon the mental courage, you can have a bad strategy or bad tactics, but nothing is worse. Nothing is more evil than betrayal. Yet betrayal is exactly what this president has done. And it sends exactly the wrong message to our allies, to our troops, and to our enemies. Our commander-in-chief should lead with American values. He should lead by the idea that there is no better friend, no worse enemy than the United States of America. Today's vote is necessary because there has been no worse enemy to the Kurds and no better friend to our enemies than this president.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 4 minutes. Mr. Hill.
I thank the Speaker. I want to thank my friend from Texas, Mr. McCall, and my friend from New York, Mr. Engel, for their leadership on this issue and that of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I did not support the failed Obama-Kerry policy in Syria. And during 2017 and 2018, I was proud to see President Trump hold Assad accountable for his use of chemical weapons. However, I have not supported the United States disengaging from Syria without a strategy since such was first proposed by the President in December. So I rise in disappointment today over this policy change and Turkey's violations of all of its promises. A small group of American forces in northeast Syria advising and assisting local forces in order to prevent instability from coming to power does not constitute an endless war. Despite being in NATO, Turkey is not acting as an ally. By our actions in this House today, Turkey will pay a steep price for its provocation. I've been told by experts with contacts on the ground that American lives are at risk directly because of Turkish actions. U.S. forces have been shelled by Turkish artillery. Our NATO ally since 1952, Turkey, who we allowed to conduct this mission, has thanked us by shelling American positions. What a sad day for the Atlantic Alliance that has shouldered so many burdens and shared so much loss in men and treasure. Syrian Kurds also announced that they'd come to an agreement with the Assad regime's forces to help against the Turkish invasion, which further entrenches Russia, Mr. Speaker, in this conflict. So now Assad and his Russian backers will bring their bloodbath over the Euphrates. We also put all the gains we've made against Daesh at risk of reversal. This all could have been avoided. Mr. Speaker, when critical American leadership disengages, America's global adversaries fill the void. Turkey must cease its military invasion of Syria. The United States must support the Kurdish communities that have been our allies against ISIS. And the White House must present a clear and specific plan for ensuring the defeat of ISIS and border integrity with Turkey. I urge all my colleagues to support the passage of this important legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arkansas yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Engel. We're in the midst of a foreign policy disaster that will be a stain on the conscience of our nation for many years to come. The situation in Syria is costing lives as we speak. Until recently, our strategy to defeat ISIS, by, through, and with our allies was working. Our small military presence in Syria was a sustainable force that denied ISIS the ability to plan and launch attacks from Syria or resurge back into Iraq. The President's impulsive decision to leave Syria without any deliberation has ignited a conflict in one of the most volatile regions on earth. This administration has managed to turn our Middle East policy on its head in a week's time. Turkey is slaughtering the Kurdish forces that have fought and died on our behalf in the fight against ISIS. In our place, Syria and Russia have quickly filled the void of American leadership. We have betrayed our allies. This is not a foreign policy that displays America's core values. It's a shameful choice that will cause irreparable damage on American interests and alliances around the world. I believe this joint resolution is what we need in this moment to combat this president's worst instincts. The joint resolution will rebuke the White House and attempt to rebalance the situation in Syria, and I urge all of my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, to support it. I yield back, Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of the time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the ranking member and the chairman for their work on this proposed resolution. But I want to remind my colleagues that one of the problems that we face in Turkey and Syria today is the failure of congressional leadership to address this issue. When I stood on this very floor during the Obama administration and the question of Syria came up, I remember many of my colleagues agreeing with me that we should not be in Syria with boots on the ground, risking our most precious assets of our young men and women without a clear authorized use of military force, congressional approval resolution to do so. We failed in the leadership here in this body. That is why, as we go through this resolution, I understand the Turkish sanctions, I understand, but make no mistake about it. By voting yes on this resolution, you are authorizing the use of military force of our men and women on Syrian soil. So if force needs to be redeployed to this area, I do not want to hear from any member of this chamber nor the Senate that we have not authorized our men and women to be there. It is time for us to set aside political cowardice because we cannot make the hard choices of approving a military force resolution. We should join and unite the House, the Senate, and the White House in one congressional declaration that we, if we put our men and women in harm's way, stand by it and stand by the Commander-in-Chief in regards to that request. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York. Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the distinguished chair and ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel and Mr. McCall, for their leadership in crafting this joint resolution condemning the administration's decision to withdraw and abandon our Kurdish allies in Syria and leave them to an unlawful assault by Turkish forces. As a combat veteran, I know firsthand that the strength of our nation is tied to our partnerships and alliances around the globe. During my 3 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, I counted on our local partners for the safety of our soldiers, and those partners depended on the U.S. commitment to them. That relationship, forged in a combat zone, is built on trust in the belief that our word is our bond. The administration's reckless decision to withdraw U.S. forces has undermined the value of our commitment not only to our Kurdish allies, who are now isolated in fighting enemies on all sides, but also our other allies around the world. The message that we are sending is that the American handshake doesn't matter. Our withdrawal is an abdication of our moral responsibility to the Kurds and undermines the belief that America is a resolute partner. It has also led to our adversaries like Russia, Iran, the Assad regime, and ISIS exerting greater influence in the region. Let me be clear. The President's decision makes us less safe and further isolates us from the very allies from whom we have drawn so much strength. The President must immediately reverse his decision to withdraw U.S. personnel from Syria, recommit to our Kurdish allies, and take a firm stance against any further aggression by Turkey against the Kurdish people. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Colorado yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Mr. Engel. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. If Turkey is not acting like a NATO ally, perhaps the sensible solution is to remove Turkey from NATO rather than keeping the United States inserted in Syria, presumably forever. This is why I oppose this resolution. I've heard my colleagues say we should not leave Syria without a strategy. Perhaps it is equally logical that we should not stay in Syria without a strategy, because in Syria we have tens of Americans stuck between armies of tens of thousands who have been fighting each other for hundreds of years and who will likely be fighting each other hundreds of years from now. Our mission to deprive ISIS of caliphate land has largely been accomplished with the help of the Kurds and with over $9 billion being paid to the Kurds. The Kurds have been fighting bravely where they live, but they have been trained, funded, and equipped by the United States. And we cannot accept the proposition that if we support a group of people because our interests align in one case, that this somehow morally binds our country to every conflict that they have, past, present, or future. To do this would constrain the utility of America's future alliances, not strengthen them. The blood of America's patriots is among our nation's most sacred currency, and it must be spent only when absolutely vital to protect American interests. We are not the world's police force. We are not the world's piggy bank. I support an America First policy on our foreign policy, and I oppose this resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nonproliferation, a very senior and valued member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
I rise in support of the resolution, and I rise in opposition to the recent decision of the Trump administration. We had a situation in Syria that was stable. We had a modest deployment of American troops. We were successful in limiting American casualties to a very low number. We had defeated the caliphate. Our friends, the Kurds, who had incurred most of the deaths by the many thousands necessary to destroy the ISIS caliphate, were safe. In other words, the situation was stable and favorable to the United States. Now we have taken an action in which America is humiliated, the Kurds are subject to slaughter, our word means less in the world, and ISIS stands to be revitalized. This is such an obvious mistake. It is hard to find anyone with any knowledge of foreign policy that regards it as anything other than an unforced error. It is such a grave mistake that it makes you wonder whether it was an intentional mistake designed to give Russia territory in northeast Syria for whatever reason we might want to do that. It is time to reevaluate our policies toward Turkey. Since the 1940s, we have safeguarded Turkey through our membership in NATO and theirs. We protected Turkey from subversion in the 1940s and protected it for the Soviet Union for decades. Recently, over the last 20 years, we've had a policy of obsequious humiliation in our approach to Turkey. We have kowtowed to Ankara in failing to recognize the Armenian genocide. In doing so, we have taken a foreign policy normally based on truth and honor, and instead humiliated ourselves through silence and concealment. It is time to recognize the Armenian genocide by an overwhelming vote here on the House. It is time for us to stop dishonor in our relationship with Turkey.
Has expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman, time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's great to come down here today and talk on this issue. I've been a little bit outspoken since the decision was made by the executive branch, so it's great to see the legislative branch take a stand and talk about what this policy decision has made. And good friend with the Chairman McCall and, of course, Elliot Engel, who's the chairman of the committee. Look, as someone who served for many years in the military, and I'm very involved with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and our alliances and values are important. Walking away from friends is a sad indication of policy that we don't want to support, we don't want to condone. Yes, we want America to be great, but we're also great because of our friends and our allies. Coalitions are not bad. Coalitions strengthen our public policy around the world. Our relationship with the Kurds go way back to the first Gulf War and the protection of the northern Iraqi Kurdish area with us protecting the airspace. Talk to people in uniform who have been protected by Kurdish fighters throughout these 20 years of involvement in this area. We give them our word that we will be with them. I liken it to being in a foxhole with someone from another country, and the attack's coming. You don't get out of the foxhole and go to the rear and leave your ally in the foxhole to defend themselves. And we see what's going on. I think this could be predicted. It's unfortunate. I don't know how we get the genie back in the bottle, but I'm glad we're getting a chance to make a statement from Article 1 of the Constitution, the legislative branch, that we think this policy has been wrong and failed, and we do it in a strong bipartisan manner. So I thank both of you for bringing this, and I look forward to voting yes on it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
It's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to a gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of our Syrian Kurdish allies who have lost thousands of men and women in the fight against ISIS at the behest of the United States of America. And I join my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to call on Turkey to end its invasion of northern Syria. Giving the Turkey the green light to go into this area will go down in history as a moral and strategic disaster. So many consequences, Mr. Speaker. Our Kurdish friends betrayed and slaughtered and now forced to align with Syrian forces backed by Iran, creating an even bigger threat to our friend Israel. ISIS now unleashed, Russian troops filling our vacuum, and our other allies wondering if we can ever be trusted again. The Trump administration's weak sanctions are like an arsonist calling in the fire department. Mr. Speaker, we must protect United States soldiers, secure our nuclear weapons in Turkey, provide humanitarian support to the Kurds, and impose crippling sanctions on Turkey until they end their Syrian campaign and, most importantly, pursue a diplomatic solution to end the conflict. And I want to end by just thanking Mr. Engel and Ranking Member Call for your bipartisan leadership. I urge adoption of this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. McCall.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the years I've served in this body, I've watched presidents of both parties make a lot of tough foreign policy decisions, many good, many bad. But I cannot think of a foreign policy decision more reckless and short-sighted than this one. With all the years and through all the years, that I have been working on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Frankly, I've never seen a president do something that's as aggravating and that should have never been done as what the president did last week. You know, when the president announced that we were going to leave several months ago, it forced the resignation of the Defense Secretary, Mr. Mattis at the time, who was so upset. That was unprecedented in American history. This is just something that's unbelievable and could have been avoided. I'd now like to yield 2 minutes to the majority leader, 1 minute, to the majority leader, famous 1 minute, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I love my 1 minute. I also love my glasses so I can read what I want to say here. Thank you very much. I rushed up from my office. I was on a conference call. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for keeping it open. And I want to thank Mr. McCall for helping to bring this to the floor. Mr. Speaker, Americans, of course, knew when President Trump took office that he was inexperienced in foreign policy and national security. That doesn't mean he didn't have opinions. He did. But he hadn't been in the day-to-day work. That was alarming. But also, from my view, alarming is his penchant for putting his own self-interest ahead of America's interest in America's national security. That troubles the world. The disastrous consequences are becoming obvious to Americans more and more each day as we watch thousands of our Kurdish allies. And this is not an issue without some complexity. I understand that. But our Kurdish allies fleeing, ISIS gathering strength, and Iran and Russia and Assad advantaged. There's rightly been broad bipartisan shock and condemnation that President Trump would so recklessly endanger Americans' allies, permit the release of thousands of violent ISIS extremists, and give to Vladimir Putin's aims in Syria. In short, he just opened the door for ISIS to reclaim some power. Any terrorist attack they now take part in will be as a direct result of this action. President Trump has betrayed the trust, in my opinion, of the American people. He has also betrayed America's friends. The Kurdish forces in northern Syria have been among America's most reliable and effective local allies. It was their blood and sacrifice that led, in part, to this being significantly successful against ISIS. It is their young men and women in uniform who have been guarding ISIS prisoners who, if released, have vowed to resume attacking Americans and destabilizing the Middle East. And in that effort, we may lose further American lives, precious to us, precious to their families, precious to our country. Our Kurdish allies trusted us to have their backs. Loyalty is a two-way street. It took years to build them into an effective fighting force. Now America's turning its back and undoing years of effort and progress. How shameful. How irresponsible. The president said he took this action because he had pledged to get American troops out of the Middle East. Ironically, he took out about 2,000 or put them someplace else, and guess what? He sent 2,000 additional troops to the Middle East. Now, it's Saudi Arabia, where ISIS is not, hopefully, doing much, at least where we're sending the troops. But how ironic it is to say that we're going to take troops out of the Middle East, and at the same time we send more troops in to the Middle East. America's reputation as a world leader depends on the bond of our word. Can we be trusted? Or are we simply responsive that day for that issue. If we abandon our allies, we will have none when we need them to stand with us. Not only has President Trump abandoned the Kurds, but he has also refused to join the world leaders in considering the Turkish attack in the United Nations. Instead, he chose to stand with Vladimir Putin and is doing his bidding once again by handing large swaths of Syria over to his control. He's moving in as we speak. Indeed, as the Washington Post pointed out this week, Russia is now the one country, front page. Russia, they said, is the one country that every country in the Middle East talks to and trusts to be a mediator. Is that an America that is great? America has abandoned that role and the power it brings. President Trump has also chosen to stand with Bashar al-Assad, as I said, a tyrant who has gassed his own people with chemical weapons and murdered hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and caused the extraordinary refugee challenge that the Europeans have. And he has chosen to play into the hands of the Iranian Ayatollahs. The President says Iran is not our friend. He is right. We played into his hand with this action. In summary, Mr. Speaker, the President's actions empower ISIS, betray our Kurdish allies, embolden Russia, reward the Assad regime, benefit Iran, and endanger Israel. These developments were sadly predictable. Experts like Brett McCurk and Secretary Mattis said this is not the right thing to do. This is not a partisan issue. This is about America. This is about our allies. This is about international security and stability. From the moment the President made clear he wanted to abandon America's strategic interests in Syria, both McGurk and General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, expressed their opposition. These developments confirm the worst fears of so many Americans from both parties who have long questioned this President's wisdom or interest to protect our country and keep it safe in a dangerous world. It is critical, Mr. Speaker, that this House, the People's House, make clear to the world that President Trump's reckless actions do not carry the support of the American people. It is critical that we condemn Turkey's incursion as well, and do so in a bipartisan way. That is what this legislation will do. And I want to commend all of those from the Foreign Affairs Committee who brought this to, I know it was difficult for some, but it's the right thing to do. The House will do everything in its power to reassure our allies and remind our adversaries that America does not cut and run, that we stand by our word and hold true to our values and stand with our friends. I hope they'll hear us and understand that this action by this President must not mar the goodwill or erode the steadfast principles upon which our country has engaged with the world throughout our history, and surely again in the future. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman has no further speakers, I'm prepared to close. Speaker, I yield myself.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is one of those rare moments in Congress where we see both sides coming together, exercising our Article I constitutional responsibilities on foreign policy. And I can't think of a better committee than this, the Foreign Affairs Committee, to stand unified as a Congress. And this is not just the House, Mr. Speaker. This is a joint resolution with the Senate. This is going to pass the House and the Senate, sending a strong message about our foreign policy. I believe that we learn from history. And the National Archives has a saying, inscription, that says, what is past is prologue. You see, history repeats itself. And we need to learn the lessons from history. I remember after we withdrew out of Europe after World War I, it allowed the forces of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler to rear his ugly head. And it took the Marshall Plan to finally put an end to it. And then as recently as 2011, the previous administration, President Obama, pulled out 10,000 troops out of Iraq. And my side of the aisle strongly objected to that foreign policy decision, arguing that it would create a wave of terrorism. And we were right. And ISIS reared its ugly head, and the caliphate was formed. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I should say, you and I served on the Homeland Security Committee, and in years 2015, 2016, the terror threat was frightening. My threat briefings were frightening in the SCIF. External operations being plotted out of Iraq and Syria to kill Americans in the United States, almost one per month. We stopped 95% of those threats, and the 5% is what the American people know about. But I'll tell you this from that experience, have not we learned anything? That we need a residual force, if anything, to protect the homeland from terror threats. Now we have over 10,000 ISIS in country and over 70,000 family members that are there as part of the insurgency. We had over 30,000 at the time of the peak of the ISIS caliphate. And we can't go back to that. I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, that this move will embolden the Russians. The Russians have already gone to our military's campsites and mocked us. They are mocking the United States of America. Iran is there. And ISIS is now emboldened. We need a residual force to protect us, as we had in Iraq. We need that in Syria. And yes, we need that in Afghanistan. We can wind down the number of troops, but we need that residual force. And I want to close. I'll never forget talking to Condoleezza Rice after she retired at Stanford. And she said, one axiom is true in foreign policy. Your allies must know. Your allies must trust you. Our allies are questioning us right now. We told them, trust us. We have your back. And what is happening now, the Kurds are being slaughtered as I speak in northern Syria. And she also said another thing. Our allies must trust us, and our enemies must fear us. That is my foreign policy. It was Condoleezza Rice's foreign policy. I think it's a good foreign policy. I want to thank the chairman for working with me to stand up on this very important issue. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure now to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Let me thank the chairman and ranking member for coming together. I was on the floor earlier and I held up the New York Times as the Syrian forces rush into U.S. void and battle lines shifting in the benefit of Iran, Russia, and ISIS. We worked very hard to get Turkey into NATO and to respect it for its secular position and its embracing of the ideals of democracy. But to now be the cause of thousands fleeing out of violence and bombing, now being the cause of ISIS supporters and families escaping, now being the cause of ISIS fighters escaping, and not listening to any form of reconciliation to put Russia as the mainstay is absolutely unacceptable. And I believe that these sanctions and this rebuke and this resolution that has indicated it was wrong to greenlight the Turkish military incursion in Syria Kurdish territory, expressing the strong support for Syrian Kurdish forces who were our allies, and calling on Turkey to immediately cease military action in northeast Syria is a question of our national security. And I add that there should be a no-fly zone. I know how challenging that would be for Turkey not to be flying over northern Syria. It is important that we do what we need to do to save the precious lives of those children who have already died and those who are fleeing the violence. Let us pass this resolution, H.J. Res. 77, but let us find a way to bring some peace and stand down in that region, and also to thank the United States military, who should not have been moved. I ask my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 77. Thank you.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, I yield as much time as I may consume. As I mentioned before, in the years I've served in this body, I've watched presidents of both parties make a lot of tough foreign policy decisions, many good, many bad, but I cannot think of a foreign policy decision more reckless and short-sighted than this one that was made by President Trump. The President of the United States, as a result, has empowered ISIS, betrayed our loyal partners, the Kurds, and jeopardized our national security. Congress must condemn this loudly and clearly. Today's resolution sends a resounding message to the White House and the world. We reject President Trump's disgraceful failure in foreign policy. I urge all members to stand by our partners, stand by our promises, stand by our values, and support this resolution. And I want to commend my partner on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCall, who takes a lot of courage to do what he did today, and I thank him for it. And that's why, as he and I both mentioned, we're proud that the Foreign Affairs Committee is perhaps the most bipartisan committee in Congress. When we go abroad, partisanship should stop at the water's edge. We all, Democrat and Republican, feel outraged at what the President did. We all feel that our allies need to be supported, and that transcends any kind of partisan politics. So I urge all of our colleagues to support this bipartisan measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass House Joint Resolution 77? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The joint.
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking the vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.